Hello and welcome to the Origins of Islam. After quite a long break, I'm finally back and we are ready to pick up right where we left off. In my last couple of videos, we've looked at some strange theories about the Dome of the Rock and when it was built and how it was built and by whom. So I figured that we should probably look at the actual history of the Dome of the Rock now. But before we can start with a deep dive, it's important to look at the history of the Temple Mount before the Dome of the Rock, because obviously there's a rich history there, and the people who built the Dome of the Rock were well aware of it, and of course that influenced them greatly. That means that a lot of people will probably know most of what I'm gonna talk about in this first video of this series, but even so, this could be a nice refresher before we look at the history from the 7th century onwards, so maybe you want to stick around anyway. Now, of course, the defining feature of the Temple Mount is the rock around which the dome would later be built. And yet, none of the descriptions of the Jewish temple in any of its versions from the time of Solomon, Zerubbabel or Herod mention this rock. We can, of course, only speculate as to why. The rock could hardly have been moved there after the destruction of the Second Temple. But maybe it was integrated into the temple structure so that its existence wasn't obvious. Maybe we are really looking at the Holy of Holies so that only a select few ever got to see it, but at the end of the day we simply do not know. The rock is first mentioned in the 4th century by an anonymous Christian pilgrim from Bordeaux. He writes, "And where the temple which Solomon built once stood, there are 2 statues of Hadrian, and not far from the statues there is a rock with a hole, to which the Jews come every year and anoint it, bewail themselves with groans, rend their garments, and so depart." On the picture to the right we can see the cave underneath the rock as it is today. It sounds like the pilgrim was referring to this space when he talked about the rock with a hole, so the hole being the cave. So now let's go all the way back. Around 961 BC, the original Temple of Solomon was being built. We don't know today where it was exactly located, but a great deal is known about its shape and fixtures from biblical sources. It was a rectangular building set on a platform with an enclosed Holy of Holies in which the Ark of the Covenant was placed. There were 2 columns in front of it, a separate altar and a large basin known as the Molten Sea, presumably filled with mercury and supported by 12 sculpted oxen. The temple's decoration of cedar and gold was certainly elaborate and probably unique for its time, but little information exists to reconstruct it in any detail. Now, Solomon's temple, with whatever changes and additions may have occurred over the centuries, was pilfered and destroyed by the Assyrians in 586 BC. The Jews had to go into their Babylonian exile. Some 50 years after the destruction of the first temple, under the leadership of Zerubbabel, a new temple was built, probably according to the same scheme as Solomon's, but without its lavish decoration. The temple was then greatly extended from 20 BC onwards under the patronage of Herod the Great. The magnificent masonry of the south and southwestern borders of the mount are from Herod's time and testify to the grandeur of his achievement. Textual references are sufficiently numerous to allow for a reasonable reconstruction of that temple, even if the several existing attempts differ from one another in a number of details. But except for its perimeter, some of its gates and probably thousands of cut stones reused for centuries thereafter, nothing remains from the temple itself, and its exact relationship to the terrain of the hill is still very much a mystery. In 66 AD, the Jews revolted against the Romans, and under General Vespasian, the future emperor, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. Around 135 AD, the Romans erected a temple for Jupiter on the Temple Mount. In front of it was a large statue of Emperor Hadrian. This led to the Bar Kokhba revolt, which resulted in the Jews being forbidden from entering the city. The Jupiter temple was demolished by Emperor Constantine the Great in the year 325 AD following the Council of Nicaea, or so the story goes. The temple may already have fallen into disrepair beforehand. Some sources claim that Emperor Julian gave permission to the Jews to build a 3rd temple in 363 AD, but that earthquakes and miracles thwarted their efforts. There seems to be a little corroborating evidence though. Then, during the Sasanian-Byzantine War, the Jews allied themselves with the Persians and regained control over Jerusalem for the first time in centuries when the Persians took the city in 614 AD. Under their leader, Nehemiah ben Hushiel, the Jews immediately started to rebuild the temple. But already in 617 AD, the alliance between Jews and Persians broke, and the Jews were once again expelled from Jerusalem. Work on the third temple was halted. After regaining control over Jerusalem, the Christians tore down the foundations of this building which the Jews started. We don't know exactly when, but it seems like it happened by 629 AD. The Temple Mount was turned into a garbage dump. But here we have to clarify a little bit. So it's often claimed that the Temple Mount was turned into a garbage dump, and that is true. But garbage dump here really means a dump for old stones, because people wouldn't just carry their garbage up the Temple Mount to deposit it there. Typically, there wasn't really that much garbage anyway in those times. Everything was reused as much as possible, so you had a little bit of organic garbage which could be used as fertilizer and such. So there was use for almost everything. Here we are mainly talking about rubble, basically. Okay, so this was a quick overview of the timeline of the Temple Mount before the Dome of the Rock. Then, shortly thereafter, on or around the 21st of March 630, a solemn ceremony still commemorated in the liturgical calendar of the Orthodox Church brought Heraclius back to Jerusalem. The emperor entered the city from the east like Christ on Palm Sunday and returned the true cross to the Holy Sepulchre. But only 5 years later, Heraclius removed the true cross and brought it to Constantinople. This is strong evidence that it was a planned and peaceful handover of power to the Arabs, which occurred only a few years later. As a Christian emperor, Heraclius wouldn't just take the cross out of Jerusalem unless he knew that new rulers would soon enter the city. So the Arabs entered Jerusalem as Byzantine clients. Sophronius surrendered the city to tribal leader Khalid ibn Thabit al-Farni in 637 AD. It was a peaceful, low-key event. Later sources imply that there was a formal treaty that would guarantee the safety of Christian places of worship. According to later legends, Caliph Umar rediscovered the rock underneath the rubble on the Temple Mount. He recognized it as the center of the earth and a place of religious significance. But we'll cover that in another video. The new Arab citizens settled in the eastern parts of Jerusalem. Now, at some point, the new Arab rulers started to tidy up the Temple Mount. The temple platform, gates and walls were restored and repaired. Jewish and Christian labor was employed. For example, we know of one story about a local archdeacon who worked on the Temple Mount and who was told by the patriarch to stop working for the quote-unquote atheists. The archdeacon was even promised employment and increased salary. He initially agreed to the offer, but 2 days later he went back to work on the Temple Mount. He was then stricken by divine wrath for his refusal of the offer. At some point, a makeshift assembly building was erected on the Temple Mount. Around 670 AD, the Christian pilgrim Arculfus describes it as an oblong house of prayer, which the Saracens pieced together with upright planks and large beams over some ruined remains. By the late 7th century, we have multiple attestations of a large-scale construction project on the Temple Mount. Temple iconography on coins from around the same time indicates that the new building was connected to the Temple of Solomon. The inscription inside the Dome of the Rock mentions the year 691 AD as its construction date. Scholars argue whether 691 was the date the dome was completed or the date construction started, though. As I said in the beginning, most people will be familiar with what we just went over, but it was important to bring the story back into the forefront of our minds, because when we talk about the Dome of the Rock, we are also talking about a long history, a long tradition. The Arabs of the 7th century were well aware of that tradition, and it did play into their decision to build the Dome of the Rock. And with that, we are at the end for today. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next video.